following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and it's my privilege to introduce another episode of Retro Rangers in the Zone. Here is George Grimm.
Hi, welcome back to Retro Rangers Podcast. I'm George Grimm, and I'm here with my co-host, Hal Bock, former writer for the Associated Press and author of many books on many sports. Tonight we're happy to welcome Mr. Jay Moran, who wrote a book called The Rangers and the Bruins and the End of an Era. Jay, how are you?
Good. Yourself? Hi, George.
Okay. Would you like to tell us something about yourself?
I'm a letter carrier, not a professional writer, but been a Ranger fan my whole life, and had a lot of fun doing this book.
Okay. Now about the book, let me just mention a couple things. It's the rivalry era of the Rangers and the Bruins. While Emile Francis and Harry Sinden were both in charge of their teams, It was published in 2009. I got my copy that Christmas, and I loved it. The book is a tome. It's 644 pages, and it weighs 3.2 pounds. It's probably the size of an old-style phone book, but much more fun and interesting to read. So, and it's also this book and Jerry Eskenazi's A Year on Ice were the inspiration for my book about Emile Francis that I wrote a couple of years ago. I read this book, and I read the Eskenazi book many times, and that's what got me going. All right, Jay. So, what about the book? What there's 48 interviews in here with members of the Rangers and the Bruins. Okay, what was your inspiration to write this book?
Well, I became a Ranger fan in the 6th grade. My best friend in grammar school, Jay Moran, a similar name, was a Ranger fan, and he introduced me into him. So in the spring of 70, they got into the playoffs against the Rangers, and I said, this is good, and I started following them since then. Back then it was, like the Red Sox-Yankees rivalry.
Right.
And really the inspiration for writing the book was just nostalgia. I mean, when you grew up following a team in the 60s and 70s, I don't care if it was basketball, hockey, football, baseball, the rosters really didn't change. You'd go 4, 5, 6 years with a couple players here and there. So you really identified with that team growing up, and, it marked just a certain time in your life, just like a song on the radio from high school. You remember that, where you were and what place. So in 2006, Brad Kurtzberg wrote a book on the SEALs, shorthanded, the Oakland SEALs, and I got in touch with him, and I asked him, well, how did you do this? And he said that he simply called the players up on the phone and talked to them, and I couldn't believe that it was that simple. The hockey players, which I found out to be true, are very humble. They love to talk about their sport, very friendly.
Right.
So I started doing some research, and about a year of that, and bought myself a Radio Shack tape recorder for a telephone and started calling players.
Yeah. What about the contact information? How did you get that?
Well, back then, it was much easier to find on the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, the addresses and names were out there. Nowadays, I don't think maybe it's still as easy, but I don't think people are just going to answer the phone like they used to, even just a decade ago. It was that easy. I was so surprised.
Yeah. No, what I tried to do, I tried to send them an email first, just to kind of get in there first. But sometimes that didn't work, and you had to call them cold, and it was tough. So
Hey, Jay, let me interrupt for a second. First of all, I must tell you that you said you were a letter carrier. My father carried the mail for 43 years, so I can sympathize with all weather and all of that stuff that you endure in doing your job.
Oh, yeah, I've been doing it for 40 years myself.
43 years my dad did it. So
Great.
Anyway, that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm curious about you called all these players. I mean, it's amazing. The list of players that I saw that you called just amazed me. I mean, some of them really were obscure players. I think of Gene Carr, for example. Gene Carr came up and he had a reputation of being the fastest skater on the team, but he was a very marginal player in that whole scenario. You know, I mean, he could skate, but there weren't a lot of goals. You know, And I'm just curious how you came up with all those names.
Oh, I simply, got the rosters and tracked them down. You mentioned Gene Carr. He was fun to interview. He was fast, but it was hard for him to break into an established roster. So they used him mostly to shadow players like Cornwallier, the fastest players, and he shut him down in the playoffs. But sometimes some injuries came along. In fact, he got hurt, and that's how Tkachuk got on the Bulldog line there, the third line, and made an opening for him.
Yeah, I remember Bill Chadwick once said that Gene Carr couldn't put the puck in the ocean if he was standing on the end of the dock. And Gene didn't like that at all. So.
No, he didn't.
No.
But I noticed you did not have the marquee line, the Rangers' marquee line, the gag line, Hatfield, Rattel, and my friend Rod Gilbert.
Yep. Not for lack of trying. I actually spoke to Vic Hatfield on the phone when he was at his golf course in Canada, and I thought we were going to set up an interview, but it just never happened. Jean Rattel, I was in contact with through the mail, and I had a winter address and a summer address. Many of these Canadian players go south, like Florida, for the winter. And everything from Rattel, my favorite player, he came back return to sender. So I got the impression he was one of the players who wouldn't even sign autograph cards for the fans. He was a very private person. Yeah, and I was never able to connect with him. Rod Gilbert, even John Halligan set me up with him at the Garden when Rod was over there, and he just never did the interview. That's one regret I did have. I did, talk to so many great players, and like Emile Francis, I spoke to 3 times. I have over 3 hours of tape with him. That was fantastic. But
Emile was fantastic, yeah.
Yeah, but Eddie, I got in contact with Ed Jockerman, and he was the heart and soul of the team. But he says, "I'm sorry, Jay, I'm just not doing interviews anymore." So for whatever reason, he didn't want to do it. And the last big name there, Brad Park, he wasn't returning them either. He wasn't. It was hard to get in touch with. So yeah, some of the big names I missed out on. That gave me some encouragement to go after even the players like Jim Krulicki had a cup of coffee. I think he played 27 games in 1 year, but someone as minor as that, one of his roommates was Gordie Howe. So there's always something interesting to find out about everybody there.
Right. Okay. The interviews.
The rivalry, I remember, listen, I covered that team in the late 60s, throughout the 60s and into the early 70s. And I remember the rivalry very like I remember my address. I mean, it was every night the same story, and you mentioned that the players were the same. There were very few changes in the roster. Every year you got the same players back, and you could count on it. You could count on the rosters being just about the same year in and year out. And the thing about the Rangers and the Bruins that I remember, those were in the days of the 6-team league. So you had Montreal and Toronto, Chicago and Detroit, the Rangers and the Bruins, 6 teams. Now, the first 4 teams, the Canadiens and the Maple Leafs, were always very good. And Chicago and Detroit were always very good. Now, you had 4 playoff spots and 4 teams.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what was that going to do for the Rangers and the Bruins? Not very much.
That's why they had
there would always be a year, it seemed like, that one of those teams would falter, and the 4th place playoff spot would be available. And the Rangers and the Bruins would fight it out for that last playoff spot. And I remember how fiercely they battled to get into the playoffs, because that was a big deal, you know. There was money to be earned, and I remember those days dearly. And it was great when, slowly but surely, Emile Francis built the Rangers into a contender, and they could battle the other 5 teams, the other 4 teams that were above them, and that was very very comforting to the fans and to the media, because listen, you don't want to cover a team that's just an also-ran. You want to cover a team that's contending, that's in there every night. Mm-hmm. And those players, when I read that list of people that you interviewed, I remembered them dearly. I mean, I remember Arnie Brown and Rod Sealing as the defensive pair, and playing together for many years. I remembered Olin Curtin back, and all the names that you had in there just brought back some great memories for me. Yeah. So, I mean, I salute you for your endurance in getting all those players.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Back when Francis was starting to take over, let's say 65, the Bruins and the Rangers always fought for last place. I think they had what was called the Patrick Cup. Whoever win 5th place, that was their Stanley Cup. They called it the Patrick Cup. And, you did bring them around. But think of the players, too. A small league, and you played each other so much. They got to know each other so well. You know, they played each other so many times.
Yeah, 14 times, I think, every year.
Yeah, there was great familiarity. You could count on certain things that the other guy's going to do, because he did them the last game, and he did them the game before that. You know.
Right.
So
right.
I mean that was an advantage to some extent, I suppose. But you're right about battling for those last couple of spots. It was fierce. It was a fierce rivalry.
Yeah. Well, there was that incident too where Ted Green speared Phil Goyette, and Bill Jennings put a price tag supposedly on Ted Green's head, and the fans were chanting "Get Green, get Green." And, kill Green. In fact, that chant was in the Garden for many years, and then, of course, the Potvin chant took over much later in the 70s. But for many years, until like another next generation of fans moved in there, they forgot about Ted Green and what had happened. I spoke to a few of the players about that, Phil Goya, and the media actually made that a bigger incident than the players did. The players, I think he had to have his gallbladder removed. He was seriously injured. But the players, almost to a man, they all said, "Oh, it happened. It wasn't, But the press took off with it, and I think Stan Fischler got Jennings to in an interview to Jennings was very emotional, and he said, Ted's an animal, and there should be a bounty on his head. You're right, yeah.
Well, there were some goofy players in the league at that time. Green was one of them. I remember Howie Young with the Detroit Red Wings. I mean, he was. You never knew what he was going to do next.
No, he was an actor. He had a mohawk haircut for a while.
Yeah,
and he was a tough guy, but he was flaky. You never knew what he was going to do. Like Hal.
To me, that was a great era of hockey. Largely because of the familiarity. The players were familiar with each other. They were familiar with the media and vice versa. And so, you knew everybody. Everybody knew everybody else.
Yep.
Now, and I mentioned this the other night in another podcast, now they've got, 31 or 32 teams, and most of the players are from Scandinavia or Russia. And I marvel at the broadcasters being able to pronounce most of the names.
Yes.
And I can't, for the life of me, I couldn't name 5 Rangers today if I had to. I mean, it'd really be difficult for me.
The rosters changed so much. Yeah.
They change, exactly. They change. It seems like they change from month to month. And new guys come in, and new guys, and old guys are let off, and just it's a rotation, you know. It's like a swinging door. That was not the case in that era. That era, there was familiarity, there was stability about it, and it made it a lot more fun, I think, to cover those games because you knew all the players.
Mm-hmm. Well, back then too, with only 6 teams, with only 6 teams and 20 players on each squad, you could probably name every player on every team.
Yes.
And, by their number.
Yes.
I know I could.
Oh yeah,
But as of now, if you ask me to name all 31 teams, I would have to sit down and think about it. I just couldn't rattle it off my head. I would have to sit down.
I had an occasion. We were watching the late news. My wife and I were watching the late news, and they were giving the scores, and here are the hockey scores: Calgary 2, Arizona 1. And my wife looks at me and she said, "Arizona has a hockey team?" And I said, "Yes. Not only does Arizona have a hockey team, there's a hockey team in San Jose. And by the way, Las Vegas." And she was shocked. She was flabbergasted by that news.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. And there's going to be one more in a year or so.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, who was your first interview?
Don Marshall. I was trying to figure out who I should do first because I didn't have much experience. And I said, well, Donnie Marshall I'm looking at the 65 to 75 decade that Francis really had this team together. And and I said, well, he was there only about half the time. Let me start with him. And I talked to him, and very friendly, but it was a lot of one-word answers. He wouldn't, elaborate or go on. And so it was great talking to him. Then I realized afterwards, boy, the first guy I start with, he won 5 cups with Montreal, and he's in I think he's in the Hall of Fame, right? And so I said, wow, even though it was a limited thing, he was back then with Phil Goyette and Bob Nevin and Harry Howell. He was with
the old smoothies.
Yeah. But it wasn't until after I said, after the interview, I said, well, that was short, but wow, I just spoke to someone with five rings.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about another thing. George mentioned before the size of your book. I'm curious if you didn't at some point say, hey, this is going to get unwieldy here. I ought to cut it off. Let me cut it off at 20 interviews instead of 40 or however many you did.
It wasn't so much the interviews, but it was lack of experience. I really should have had an editor. Something as simple as double spacing rather than single spacing would have saved me a lot of pages. I had the idea of this book of being a reference guide. I have in here every game, the box score from every game that the Rangers played for that decade, and every playoff game, all the trades, so that, all of a sudden you realize, wow, this is like a telephone book. So that's a fair criticism of the book being too big and unwieldy. And then there's also over 100 photos in there, which I thought was key. Unfortunately, photography when you're doing a book is expensive. But but if you do keep it in black and white, even though I had a lot of color photographs, I formatted the book in PDF, and that way I can get it past the publisher to have all the photos in there, and it was just as cheap as printing a one page. So the photos were very important. There was a photographer, Al Ruel. He covered the Bruins for maybe 30 years, and at some point his collection went up for auction, and someone bought it for, I want to say $36,000, and then to help pay for it, he started selling it off piecemeal, and I was lucky enough just at that time because when I first started, I didn't know what I was going to do about photographs. I was able to buy many of these negatives. Many had not been seen before, or there were a few famous ones in there, but I'm very proud of that being in the book. Some great photos from that era.
Yeah, well, talking about the pictures, I have to thank you for that too, because when I did my book, I wanted to have pictures too, but everything was owned by Getty Images, and it was a lot of money. And so I emailed Jay, and I said, "Where'd you get these pictures?" And he was, he was kind enough to share them with me. And the pictures of that you see in my book about Emile Francis are really his pictures, and I thank you very much for that, Jay.
Oh, you're welcome.
Really, you really saved me.
Love the subject matter.
Yep,
I've got 3 words for you guys. If you're doing any more books and you're looking for pictures, Library of Congress.
Okay.
They have a tremendous archive. I used them for my book, my Chicago Cubs book, and it was very helpful. Very helpful.
Now you tell me.
Where were you when I needed you, right?
I know, yeah.
I'm a lifelong Cubs fan too, by the way. I've been following them since '66, and the Cubs and Rangers didn't win for years and years, so they were a nice pairing.
Yeah.
Again,
the name of my book is The Last Chicago Cubs Dynasty. And I wrote about the Cubs when they ruled the National League in the first decade of the 20th century.
Okay.
They won 4 pennants and 2 World Series. And who would ever think that the Cubs could win 4 pennants and 2 World Series? So that's what interested me, and I went about researching that and I wrote. Very proud of that book. Came out a few years ago. But
okay. As far as the interviews, who was your best, most interesting interview?
Oh, definitely Emile Francis, without a doubt. He's just so passionate, and he could talk for hours. In fact, I, after a couple of the interviews, said, "I've taken up enough of your time," even though I wanted to talk more. He was just, just so engaging, and he loved the subject. One of my favorite stories he had was they were supposed to catch a plane to Montreal, but the weather was bad, so they had to get a bus. And so they got everyone on the bus, and the driver's there, and there's a woman on the front seat. And Emile says, "Well, who's this woman?" He says, "That's my wife. She's coming with us." He says, "Oh no, there's no woman's going on my bus." So okay, I'll drop her off. And there was a bar before, I forget which bridge, but he got off, parked at the bar, and they went inside. And 15 minutes go by, and Emile goes in the bar, and everyone, of course, knew him. And he said, "Anybody see this bus driver?" "Oh yeah, he went out the back, got a taxi, and took off." So it wasn't, well, obviously it wasn't his wife. And then he called the bus company, and they sent the bus driver over, or another bus, and the guy was about 70 years old, and he only went 50 miles an hour going all the way up to Montreal. But they got there. I don't know if it took them 12 hours or not, but that was an amusing story from him.
Yeah. No, with Emile too, he still has that voice. He still has that cadence when he talks. It's I could listen to him forever. It's just a fantastic guy. So
I'll tell you a funny story about Emile. I worked for the Rangers. My first job out of college was working for the Rangers, and this was in 1962 when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And everybody was on edge, very much like people are on edge today about this virus that's going around. And it was a scary time. I mean, I remember it very vividly. And I would come to the office, and Emile had a little office behind our office, just beyond our office. And he was in there, and he was chortling. And I'm thinking, what is this guy laughing about, So I went in to see him. I said, "Cap, what's up?" He said, look, they've got the map of the range of the missiles, and North Battleford is not in anybody's range. North Battleford, Saskatchewan, which was his hometown. So we're safe in North Battleford. I said, "That's terrific, but I live in New York,
Yeah.
But he was a fun guy to be around. He really was.
Yeah.
Do you remember NBC used to have the hockey on Sunday afternoons?
Yeah.
Peter Puck.
Oh yeah. And then they had the showdown, the penalty shot 101 contest.
That's right.
Those were great.
That's in your book too. Yeah, that's in
yeah, because Gilles Villemure ended up winning it, and he told me about how they did it. They filmed the entire thing in one day, and they would just film shot after shot, and they wouldn't tell the players which shot they were going to use for the show, and he ended up winning. And I remember I think he ended up with like about $19,000 in prize money for that, which back then for those players was a lot of money.
Yeah.
But that was just another one of those things from that era.
Yeah.
I think it was 1974. That was.
The Rangers had a colony in Long Beach. They lived. Many of the players lived in Long Beach here on Long Island.
Yep.
And they practiced at a little rink called Skateland, which was about 10 minutes from my house where I lived in Mineola at the time. And so we would go there, and we could catch David Jockman. Eddie Jockman's son played with my son. Villemure had a son, I believe, who played with my son. So it was a lot of fun. The proximity you had proximity as a civilian to the players, and it was a lot of fun for the fans who would come out and watch they would watch the practice, or they would watch our kids practice and play. So it was it was a great time in that era of hockey.
Yeah, I went out there once on a Saturday afternoon to see the Rangers practice, and it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
As far as the interviews, you and getting like one-word answers. I think it was Rod Sealing. I got a lot of one-word answers from. He didn't seem like he wanted to talk, and I felt like saying, "Hey, Rod, I didn't boo you out of New York. I wasn't one of those fans. I want answers." But I got what I wanted out of him, and he was okay. But there's other guys who just talk a lot. Derek was great.
I had an interesting interlude. Poor Arnie Brown just passed away a couple of months ago, and we were in the locker room one night, and I worked for the Associated Press. Arnie Brown motions me over to his locker, and I'm thinking, what now? What have I done, And he says, hey, what's the Associated Press? And I said, well, it's like the Canadian Press. Canadian Press is the wire service in Canada. It's a wire service that goes out to various newspapers all across the country and the world, actually. And I thought to myself that he was interested to ask me that question. And I thought that was terrific, because certainly athletes today, are so self-centered and they could care less about who you are or where you work,
Right.
And I thought that was really an interesting interlude with the late Arnie Brown.
Yeah, I enjoyed talking to him. Yeah. I remember in the system the Rangers had, the defensemen were supposed to be defensemen. They weren't supposed to be offensive-minded. And Arnie Brown and what was the other one I'm thinking of?
Nielsen, Jim Nielsen?
Nielsen, he didn't want to be interviewed. He didn't like something someone wrote about him in a book. And at the time, I should have said, well, we'll do the interview, and I'll give you the entire interview. You can approve it. And I didn't even think of that. But he didn't do it. Ab DeMarco. Again, both Arnie Brown and Ab DeMarco told me that they got the puck, and they just kept coming up ice, and so they kept going, and they went basically end to end and scored a goal. And when they got back to the bench, Emile wouldn't even look at him because his defensemen, except for Brad, weren't supposed to score. So that's just something I remember that's a little odd that you think you'd be happy with it, but no, that wasn't the Francis way.
Well, who changed the game? Bobby Orr. Bobby Orr became the offensive defenseman, the prototype for an offensive defenseman. Yeah. And when the Rangers, when Brad Park came to the Rangers, he was supposed to be the Rangers' version of Bobby Orr, and in many ways he was.
Mm-hmm.
So and also speaking of the rivalry between the Bruins and the Rangers, no trade that I can remember rocked the hockey world more than when the Rangers traded Brad Park and Jean Rattel to Boston in exchange for Phil Esposito and Carol Vadnais.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another defenseman.
Joe Zanuzzi.
Joe Zanuzzi, yeah.
And
but,
right now, if you ask me, I can't tell you which way he went.
That was a blockbuster.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I was so upset with that. I didn't even watch them for a month after that. I just I couldn't believe they traded to their rival. They traded my favorite player, and it's like, that point on, sort of the Francis era was ending. The team was changing so drastically because they did that trade. They traded Villemure. They traded Jockeman. I mean, they were, and the team
Camille Henry. When they traded Camille Henry, Cat Francis almost got into a fight in the press room with one of the writers who was asking him, why would you do that? Why would you trade Camille Henry? And it got ugly, a little bit ugly and heated, but he was defending the trade,
Yeah, you wanted to get younger with that one, yeah. He needed some younger players, yeah.
Also bigger, because that trade brought along Doug Robinson and Wayne Hillman, I think.
That is correct.
They needed that size. Hillman was older, but Robinson was younger, but they were bigger. They needed bigger players, and Henry was one of the smallest guys in the league at the time.
Yes.
That was one of the problems with the Rangers. He needed to get some guys. He traded for Reg Fleming, and he was a good policeman. Orlon Kurtenbach was one of the strongest guys in the league when they got him, and he was an enforcer that simply no one wanted to fight. So, you look at his stats, and they needed a few guys. Ron Harris, he was a solid figure, but they were missing a few of them. So, toe-to-toe with the Bruins, I think the Bruins were rough, but they didn't cross the line like the Philadelphia, the Flyers. The Flyers just took it to another level, and I to this day can't understand how they won if they led the league in penalties. How do you score when your guys are in the penalty box?
That's right.
But
they had a hot goalie. They had Bernie Perroni's hot goalie, and they were able to score. So
Dale Rolfe one year, I think in my notes I have he led the team in penalty minutes with 74. Dale Rolfe, and he said I talked to him, and he said, well. There was probably hooking or little ticky-tack things like that because he wasn't a fighter. And
no, that's for sure. No. As far as Orlon Kurtenbach, he had an allergy to the gloves, and he used to have to wear white gloves underneath, the hockey gloves, and he would drop his glove, and you see these white fists swinging around out there. It was an interesting time. But Bobby Orr was the reason why the Rangers didn't win the Stanley Cup.
Oh, yeah. So, best player I think I ever saw play, and he just changed the game, and he was just so fast. Yeah.
Well, Gene Cole...
Well, that's the point. He changed the game.
Yes.
When you say the best player you ever saw, when I came along in 1961 or thereabouts, the Chicago Blackhawks had a guy named Bobby Hull. And he was frightening because he had a slap shot, and I thought to myself, he's going to kill somebody with that thing. I mean, he would wind up and he would just let go.
And
he was a scary player to me. And of course, Gordie Howe, but one of the players, and we've lost an important player this last week. One of the great players of our league was the great Rocket, Maurice Richard, and his little brother, the Pocket Rocket, Henri Richard, passed away this week. And people know about the Rocket because he was a star among stars. I mean, the great Canadian team was packed with great players: Jean Beliveau, Dickie Moore. Up and down the lineup, Boom Boom Geoffrion, who later came to the Rangers. But so Henri Richard followed the Rocket, and people kind of looked the other way. Yeah, he's a good player, nice player, good playmaker. He won 11 Stanley Cups, a record 11 Stanley Cups. And he passed away this last week, sadly, at age 84. But he was a great player, and he was... That's the example I always cite. The Canadians had great players up and down the lineup. The The Rangers might have had one great line, or maybe a great line and a couple of good defensemen, but they didn't have that great quality from top to bottom that a team like the Canadiens did. And of course, the Bruins were the same as the Rangers. The Bruins had some very good players. Don't kid yourself. I remember Johnny Busick was a heck of a player for the Boston Bruins.
Yep. Right.
And they had others as well. But they didn't have the quality up and down the lineup that the Canadiens had each year in and year out. Doug Harvey, who later came to the Rangers as well. Tom Johnson on defense. Terrific players. I mean, all-stars up and down the lineup. Yeah. And Henri Richard was one of those players.
Yeah, Montreal always had a speed, too. They were so fast, the whole team.
Yes. Well, you mentioned Cournoyer before. Terrific player. Terrific player.
Yeah, Roadrunner. When you talk about Henri Richard, he won 11 cups, and his brother Maurice won 8. So they had their names on the cup 19 times. Now, the Patrick family, between Lester and Craig, and I think there's a brother Dick, they have their name on the cup 13 times. So the Richards are still winning in that battle. But can you imagine that? Being able to win the cup 11 times? We win one
year in
every
and year out. You had the same roster. You had the same great players wearing the red, white, and blue of the Canadiens year in and year out. Yeah. I remember, and I told this story the other night as well, when I worked for the Rangers, our office was in Madison Square Garden, and there was a door. You walked through that door literally into the arena. And when the Rangers were playing the Canadiens, I would, be preparing press notes or whatever, and then I'd get ready to walk into the arena and walk through that door, and I'd look down on the ice, and the Canadiens were practicing. And here was Jacques Plante in goal, and who's unbeatable. I mean, he also came to the Rangers later in his career, but he was unbeatable. And I'm thinking to myself, well, Gump is going to have to play a shutout tonight if we're going to get a point, because that we're not going to score on Jacques Plante, because they were so great. That Canadian team was above and beyond the rest of the league, frankly. It was almost unfair,
Even in the 70s, they basically repeated that run, too. They were so good in the 70s.
Yes, they did. And that original team that I mentioned forced a rule change. It used to be that when you got a penalty, you sat out the full 2 minutes, and the team with the power play could score 3 goals, 4 goals. And they did. And they did, until it occurred to the league, this is not good. So once you score a goal, the power play is over. But the Canadiens forced that rule change. That's how good they were.
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't think we've had a dynasty since the Islanders, right? Maybe 4 in a row. Basically, since then.
What about Edmonton? How many did Edmonton win? I don't remember.
2.
As far as Jacques Plante, why don't you tell us a story about the measurement of the goal?
No, that's a good story.
Yeah.
Now I'm working for the Rangers, and Plante was playing at that time, I think maybe for Toronto. Or maybe he was still with Montreal, I'm not sure. At any rate, he was such a perfectionist that he decided that the goal, the nets in Madison Square Garden were not the standard size. And he complained to the league. And word came down from league headquarters in Montreal or Toronto. We want you to measure the nets. So I was a low man on the totem pole. They sent me down into the bowels of Madison Square Garden with the building superintendent to measure the nets. And darn, if the nets were not the standard size, they were an inch or 2 off. And I came back and I reported to Muzz Patrick, who was the general manager at that time. And I said, Muzz, I got bad news. Plante is right. They're not the standard nets. And Muzz put his finger to his mouth like, shh, don't say anything. And the next game we had new nets. So Jacques was a perfectionist. He knew the slightest thing being off, he knew about it.
Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah, the Bruins picked him up for the 73 playoff run, and he actually shut the Rangers out in during the regular season, but in the playoffs he was not good. Remember Harry Sinden telling me that he was surprised. He thought he had made a good move, getting him a veteran, and it just didn't work out in '73.
Okay. And you interviewed John Halligan, right? He's one of my favorite people. How is he? How was he to?
Oh, he was wonderful. He doesn't get enough credit. Not only was he the PR man for the Rangers, but he was really the team historian. If you name one player, he remembered them. And he had, I remember one time when Phil Esposito was in charge in the Garden, and Phil was just throwing stuff out, photos and records and files, and he went into the dumpster and rescued some of the stuff. This is, history, but he was a good source to bounce things off of, talking about players and insights and things like that. Great man.
Yeah.
Well, you ought to be saluted for your persistence and your diligence in getting all these people to talk to you. And you've contributed a very important volume to Ranger and Bruin history and to hockey history, and that's to be celebrated, and you should be proud of that, Jay.
Oh, thank you. I couldn't believe one day when the Hockey Hall of Fame contacted me and they had said, "We heard you have a new book. We would like to get some." They got 3 copies of it. I said, I can't believe my book is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. I mean, because I'm not a professional writer. I just love the subject matter, and now also I have all these tapes of the players that I grew up watching, and I can listen to them, and some have passed away now, and it was a great era and a great rivalry. It really was.
Yeah. Well, that book is also on the shelf out in John Halligan's house too. I went out there and visit his wife after he passed away, and there it was on the shelf. I said, "Hey, it's Jay's book. How cool is that?"
Well, you should be proud of it, Jay. It's a great contribution to hockey history.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Thanks for being on, Jay. We appreciate it. If you get any more books going, let us know. We're glad to talk about it. And
thanks for having me on. It was an honor.
Right.
I could talk about this era all night.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
thanks a lot, Jay.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks
Good night.
a lot. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.